Yeah, so this is going to be kind of a personal interview. We're focusing on Tanner as the person. So we're going to start off with some pretty easy stuff. We want you to answer from your own experience, and then later as we get on, we're going to talk more general about like, you know, things about the tribe and your community. So let's start off with some hard ones: your name, pronouns, and indigenous nation.
Okay. My name is Tanner Menard, and he or they is fine. And I am a former council person with the Attakapaw Eshok Nation of Southwest Louisiana and Southeast Texas. I'm also consider myself a Louisiana Creole, and quite a bit of my family are also people of French Acadian and Mi'kmaq descent. So I also know that I have some indigenous heritage from South Texas. So I try to acknowledge all of those people. I also know that on my grandfather's side, um, since you said indigenous nations, he was a French. His family were French Celts, and I believe that those are indigenous people. So I want to acknowledge that lineage as well. But I do consider myself to be an Attakapaw or an Eshok person.
Tanner, where are you from and where are you living now?
I grew up in a little hamlet called Sharon, Louisiana, which is between Youngsville and Erath, Louisiana. It's it's not even a town. And I grew up on property that belonged to my Eshok family. So that's that's literally where they were from. Um, and I've been living in Arizona since, let's see, I moved there in 2017, and I am currently an MFA candidate at Northern Arizona University. So I'm residing in Flagstaff, which is the traditional territory of the Diné people and the Hopi people, and a number of different tribes from the Southwest.
That kind of brings me to the next question of like, we understand a little bit of where you're from and where you're living now. Just trying to piece that together. Could you give me like a, for this conversation, a quick overview about your life and, your circle on that and kind of how you got where you are and, just like a quick life story in 3 minutes or so.
I mean, my family is culturally Cajun and Creole. I always grew up knowing that my dad was an indigenous person. My dad, he looks very indigenous, but culturally they lived like Creole and Cajun people. It's something that I took it upon myself to know more about as I grew up. And I think that is a pretty common story for what I call a Louisiana Indian. I think it's a like extremely common story. I was a kind of weird kid. I started writing classical music when I was like 10 years old, and I studied classical music at LSU. I put out 10 albums of experimental ambient music. And then when I was about 30, I'll say this too. When I was 8, on my mom's side of the family, on both sides of my family, there were a lot of traitors in the family, and my aunt passed a treatment on to me when I was 8. But she didn't. She just kind of like did it, and she explained it. But you know, there's spirits that come along with those things, and I had a lot of bumps in the night along the way up until I was about 29. And then when I was 29, the bumps in the night got more intense. And I knew that at that time I was working in New Orleans for the New Orleans AIDS Task Force doing HIV prevention work. I had a good job. I was releasing a lot of albums. I was going all around the United States performing these 9-hour long concerts while people slept. But I wasn't doing well emotionally. And I said a little prayer that I wanted more love to come into my life. Because I realized I desperately needed it. And about 3 weeks later, a woman contacted me who called herself the Love Artist. And she said, I want to do a dream yoga ceremony while you do this sleep concert. And the night before we do that, I'm sponsoring a Native American church ceremony. So I got on a plane and I went, and I knew that was the answer to my prayer. And when I ate that, you know, holy sacrament peyote, it changed my life immediately. And I dropped everything, and I just started going to Native American church ceremonies. I mean, I would for about 8 years. I went at least every week, and I just chopped wood and carried water. I chopped a lot of wood. And I then, you know, I started taking on the officer positions in that ceremony. I would, you know, be a fire person, and I would learn how to hit the drum and take care of cedar. The only thing I don't do in there is actually run the ceremonies. And then someone someone gave me permission to start running sweat lodges, and I asked permission of Chief Edward Crashant if he would be okay with me using a sweat lodge as an Eshok person. He gave me permission to do that. So I will, on occasion, if someone asks me, also run a sweat lodge, but I don't talk about it publicly very often, you know, that I'm a traitor and that I run sweat lodges. But for this conversation, I'm going to say that in public. And recently, I also became a Kundalini yoga instructor, and I'm a poet.
Could you
So that
yeah, that's great. I feel like there's a few things on there that like I'm thinking the audience might be lost at on stuff. Particularly, let's start off with, can you describe what a traitor is?
well, my understanding is that tradition was both an indigenous European tradition that, you know, because the people who came here, the Acadian people who came here, were French Celts, to my understanding, and they were very kind of earthy folk who got converted to Catholicism by Jesuits who went to Nova Scotia. And my whole side of the family, they were very mixed when they got here. I have a fair amount of Mi'kmaq heritage. So the stories that my aunt tells about that was that the prayers were Catholic prayers, but her father, who passed a prayer to her to treat for a particular condition that she passed to me, Those were Catholic prayers, but like her mother was an herb doctor, like a serious herb doctor, and her husband's mother was an herb doctor, and they know all kinds. I mean, they know, like, they can walk around their yard and they can treat people for all sorts of things with just little herbs in their yard. And they pretty much live right by Vermilion. They live right by the marsh that leads into Vermilion Bay. So they tell me about all these different plants that are in the swamp, basically, that you can treat people for different things. So they were, and they, you know, there were a lot of Atakapa people that lived in that area. So they learned, the French people who showed up there learned about herb doctoring from the indigenous people who lived there, and you know, they combined it with Catholic prayers, and with, you know, they used, they did a lot of weird things to treat people. And I mean, they did a lot of, I mean, they're beautiful things, but you know, a modern person would consider it weird. So I think that a traitor is similar to a curandero or a medicine person, because they use, and all they do is act as a vehicle, because there are spirits that follow families around and actually do the treatment. And that's what was, you know, that's that's the part, you know, that the reason I don't really talk about it very much is that those ones that actually do the treatment are the ones that do the treatment. You know, you're just kind of there.
Like, did I understand what you were saying just there is like more of like a conduit than, is that what you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if my aunt was going to talk about it, she would say that it was the Blessed Mother that was doing the work. But my direct experience of it is that um, there are very powerful spiritual entities that take a liking to certain families, and they've been, my family. And you know, when I spoke to my aunt about it, the way I explained it, how I was, had an experience of it, and she said yes, but her words would be different. But when I spoke to her about it, I said, there is a very good spirit that likes our family, and she said yes. And I feel like that's how the tradition, how it works, is that there are spirits that like your family, and they want to help your family out, and they follow you around, and they pick, they mark people in your family that have the characteristics, um, that have the character, because it does, you know, it takes a certain type of person to work with that. um, I mean, I can't speak for anybody else about it. I can only tell you about how I've had an experience of it and how it works through me. You know, other people will talk about it differently, but um, in my case, this spirit likes our family, and there's certain things that have happened to a number of us, like with lightning and different things like that. That that's how they kind of let you know that you're the one, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But yeah.
I would feel, I don't think I have this experience. So this is just like me listening to you and thinking about stuff, but it would make me feel, if I was in that situation, like I was almost like a keeper, like I would have this feeling that like it was part of my responsibility to maintain the good relationship between your family and that spirit. Is that something that's real, or is that something that happens?
Yeah,
Is that how it works?
I mean, that's how it says work for me. um it can be a crushing responsibility from time to time. um I think especially as a queer person, and and as just like a person who's living in the 21st century, you know what I mean? Like, I think that those sort of responsibilities get kind of heavy because, you know, you get, I feel pulled from time to time in a lot of different directions. Um, and I feel like some of the things that I have to do to live in the 21st century, um, it becomes complex to maintain those sort of relationships, you know, because the way that we exist in the world today is, or the way that our modern society is constructed is not built on relationality. And, you know, like for instance, I'm drinking a bottle of water that's in plastic because if you drink water that comes out of the sink here, it's full of whatever, you know, poison basically. So I don't have a relationship with where the water I'm drinking comes from. And that's against the rules. That's against the rules of being a human being.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I mean, that's just one example, you know what I mean? But like, just like, how are you obtaining your food? How are you obtaining your, you know, like I have an some kind of undiagnosed autoimmune condition. I'm allergic to all sorts of food. And when I talk to the people in my family, they just say, well, we never had that. We ate whatever we wanted. Nobody got sick. And I really think it's because we don't know where our food is coming from. You know, like, I tried to get I tried to buy, you know, ethically grown meat. I have to eat meat um, because of my condition. I try to get ethically grown meat, but it makes, you know, the relationship between me and the animal and the earth is missing.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think like when you have to go, when you have to go into the world and we're in these Zoom calls all day and we're doing this and we're doing, you know, it's like an interruption between our relationship between the spiritual forces in our life and the earth and ourselves. And I find, you know, that is something that I work hard on trying to rectify for myself. But I think it's a thing that we need to think about. Not only, I mean, not only as indigenous people from Louisiana, but just as human beings. It's the way that our life is structured breaks all the rules of being a human being.
What what role, so in the story that you were telling, the first thing that I heard was you were talking about, being gifted at as a young age as a traitor. And then the next thing that I heard you say was very important to you was your relationship with music and the development of music and the creation. It sounded like it started off classical, but I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about what that is and what it means to you.
Yeah, I think, thank you for asking that question. I grew up on a family farm, and I think it was an escape route for me. I think that it was a way in. It was a way in because I did not I knew something about how things were around me was not right, and I didn't like it. I didn't like it, and I remember that I was just like good at it, and it was a way for me to escape into my imagination as a kid. And I think a lot of it was that I'm, gay or whatever, whatever. I don't like any of those words anymore. But, I knew I wasn't like a lot of the people that were around me. And I knew that Catholicism was, for me, it was bullshit. And I knew that that was a way into a world. It was a way for me that was into a world that I could get out of that situation. And um and I loved it. I loved it. I was really good at it. And when when I graduated from LSU, I went to San Francisco and I worked with this really interesting artist named Not Human, who's a really kind of a profound member of the experimental noise community. He was on the board of the Ars Electronica, and so when I went to San Francisco, I got involved in like glitch art and noise art, and I kind of came around during like the MySpace era where a lot of independent ambient and sound art work was coming out. And so I got involved in publishing with like independent labels, and I did a lot of I did quite a number of installations at one point. And yeah, it was an important part of my life for a long time.
I have two questions. The first one was just personal curious. Were you part it because I went to LSU too, and I was at the time I was working. I worked in this digital fabrication lab that was right next door to the digital music lab. So I was wondering if you were you part of that experimental music, like the laptop orchestra group at LSU, or
I worked with Steve Beck before he created that laptop orchestra.
wow.
We were when I was there I graduated in 2001. And so we were still, when I started doing computer music, we were still coding it, like writing music in code.
Wow.
And 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 I was using a program called Kima at LSU. And then yeah, I work with a guy named Andrew Weathers who has a label in Texas called Full Spectrum Records, and we put out, actually Jeffrey, who's on the call, was at a performance we did that we released an album of it, um, that is like my poetry, that kind of like indigenous poetry and experimental music that got recognized in the Wire magazine a couple years ago. And so I do release sound poetry work with Andrew Weathers. And I write poetry as well. I kind of channel poetry, actually. That's what I do.
I feel like there's so many different directions I want to go right now that I try to get on track with things and see what I want. I mean, I feel like I want to hear more about Native Church. You mentioned a few times that relationships were important. You mentioned that like you're not comfortable with a few words that are being used around your queer identity. You're mentioning this poetry and channeling that. Do you have a sense of what you want to talk about next?
Yeah, I want to talk about the list
Okay.
first.
Okay.
You know about the list?
No.
I want to talk about it because I have not talked about it in public. There is a list right now being compiled of quote unquote pretend Indians. And it's that has really affected me as a human being and as an artist. And I want to talk about it because um, basically no tribe in Louisiana, other than tribes that are not from Louisiana, um, like are probably likely to become federally recognized because of how the the United States colonized Louisiana.
Could I have,
And so,
could
hmm,
you tell a little bit more about the list? Is it a
yeah,
physical list written in stone? Who's writing it? Where is it?
I'm not going to talk about who's writing it, but it's mostly compiled by federally recognized indigenous people who are basically trying to, in my opinion, consolidate indigenous identity to federally recognized tribes.
Okay.
And I want to understand that I want to say publicly that I understand that sentiment because I think that the history of colonization is very complex, and I understand the sentiment. I understand why people feel the need to do that, and I understand that there are people who take advantage of, and I think that in general people have gone crazy with identity. Like I think that it's a nuanced thing, and I think that right now there's a sort of fanaticism around identity taking place, and I think it's manufactured and artificial in general.
Mhm.
And um, because who we are as people is not, it doesn't have anything to do with how we look or what we do in the world. We are spiritual entities having a human experience. And so I think that the focus on physical identity is a trap in general. But since we are human, like it, that's sort of the nuance of it. We are human beings, and there are certain things we have to protect. Um, but there is a list being compiled by federally recognized Native people that um, seeks to exclude people in the literary and artistic communities and in academic communities who identify as indigenous and who are not part of a federally recognized tribe. And there are people in the Atakwa Ishak Nation who are very well known academics who have been placed on that list. And um, you know, I don't like it. I don't like it because I think that the history of indigenous people in Louisiana is not very well understood. And so that's why I wanted to talk about it. It's not to criticize the people making the list, but to say to them and to say to other people, I would like you to understand the history of colonization in Louisiana, um, and who we are as indigenous people in Louisiana, um, and that our experiences are often very complex. Sometimes we don't grow up knowing that we're Native, or sometimes we do and we're not associated with a tribe. Sometimes we have 4, 5, 6, 8, 10 different tribes in our family. Some of our tribes have 10 tribes and are now a new tribe. And my understanding, I mean, in my family, the stories are that um, people had to hide in the woods because people were being killed and people were being sent on the Trail of Tears or whatever else was happening to people, and the indigenous people had to hide in the woods. They intermarried, um, and so we don't have the same sort of relationship with the United States government that federally recognized tribes have, which is basically that a lot of them signed a treaty when they lost the war against the United States government and were put into the concentration camps that are known as reservations. And that did not happen to a lot of our tribes in Louisiana. Um, and so I would just I'm seek rather than trying to extend that fight, I would like to open a dialogue about tribes in Louisiana with federally recognized tribes.
Wow. So that makes a lot of sense. I'm thinking like I'm hearing the sides of it too, where like there is this feeling of like an invading force, or like there's this idea that there is something that needs to be protected, and there might be a line or something that, you know, that needs to happen. But I'm also hearing this feeling that like this line is excluding people who have experiences that are relevant, and, you know, and are very much contributing to that, and limiting that as a perspective. I'm sorry, I'm just kind of gathering my thoughts and trying to listen to you there. But I guess what my next question would be is, you know, do you have any idea of like this? It doesn't sound like this system is working. Do you have any suggestions on like a different way to do this that would be better, or should it just be eliminated altogether, or how would you solve this problem differently?
I I I think that when I meet a person from the United Homa Nation, or when I meet a person from the, like the Choctaw Apache of Ebarb, or when I meet any person, any indigenous person from Louisiana, we're so similar, and our stories are so similar. The way that things worked out, and the relationships that we have to the land. There's so much similarity, and I feel like, it's also, I feel like, because of the way colonization took place and the way indigenous people lived in order to survive here, which was often through mixing, or through being, through mixing through enslavement, or mixing through, rape, or mixing through intermarriage, or whatever it was that people did to survive. Our stories are very similar, yet they're very distinct. And I believe that we would be wiser to confederate as Louisiana Indians with, and acknowledge our unique histories. But I think that we would be wiser to confederate in the same way that Métis people did in Canada, because I think that we share a similar history with Métis people in Canada. I'm not saying I'm right. I'm just telling you what I've had a thought about. Um, and I also recognize why, some people would say, no, that's a terrible idea. And I acknowledge and honor people's feelings about that. Um, but I think that we have so many similarities, um, that for various reasons, that would be a good idea. And I think that, we don't have to give up, and I'm speaking for myself. I think that I don't have to give up my indigeneity, like my knowledge of myself, but I can acknowledge the difference between my experience and a Dene person who grew up on the Navajo reservation, whose grandparents spoke Dene Bazad, and who's, like, still have medicine men that know traditional ceremonies in their family, and who, exist in a different relationship with the government than my family does. I think that those differences can be acknowledged without me having to diminish my indigeneity. And I think that there has to be a way for us to be able to communicate about these things, so that people from tribes, especially Afro-Indigenous tribes, um, do not have to be excluded from conversations about indigeneity. And just, like, I'm not going to be told that I am not an Indigenous person. You know what I mean? But for instance, I live in Navajo territory, and and I have wonderful experiences with Navajo people. I go to ceremonies with them. They have run ceremonies for me. I've been adopted into Dene families, for instance. And I have wonderful relationships with them, but I also know that I'm often not considered an indigenous person by many people in the Southwest. And sometimes people are threatened by me saying that I'm indigenous. Um, and I understand where they're coming from and I acknowledge it and I get it. But I'm also not going to diminish myself. Or and I know that the medicines that have been bestowed on me and the spiritual ways that I have, they're really strong and they're valid and they're good. And so I it's funny because I'm home. I'm in Louisiana right now while I'm having this conversation, and I feel I feel like I can be myself. I feel like I can be myself, and I think that when I'm in the Southwest, often I feel like I have to hide myself because I feel like I'm in someone else's territory, and I am, and I think that it's one of the dangers of identity politics, which I have participated in the past, both as an activist and as an artist. Um, but what I think the danger of that movement is that um, several fold. One is the basis of it is postmodernism and post-structuralism, which are European continental philosophies. Materialist philosophies based in phenomenology, which is the belief that what you see is real. Which is not, that's not an indigenous way of looking at the world. And it's artificial language used to deconstruct parts of reality. But we know as indigenous people that reality is a series of relationships. And the postmodern language and the postmodern thought, post-structuralist thought, which is supposed to be a non-essentialist way of looking at the world, has devolved into a sort of essentialist, sectarian sort of thing where there's a sort of puritanical zeal moving through it, so that this person is this way and that person's that way, and you can't use this because you're this, and it's devolving into something that I don't think any of us are going to want to live in. And so I think that when what I see as a mixed race person, and as a person who comes from a line of people that are we're very brackish people, is how do we reestablish relationality among all people on this planet so that we can survive? Because the reality is that as we are focused on these sort of like artificial sectarian conflicts, there are artificial intelligences that are now like writing themselves, and the planet is on fire, and we're not going to survive if we don't figure out how to start sharing with one another again. And I don't even know that it's possible in the world, this like we have this amazing potential to be completely open because of the internet and because of artificial intelligence. And yet we're fracturing into all of these sectarian units on the one hand. And I feel like it's a fear response because we don't understand the potential of the ability that we have to share in this new time that we're moving into. So I'm very interested in how do we know who we are as human beings while being able to live in a new era of syncretism.
Let's make
How do we do it? How do we do it? You know, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I didn't mean to cut you off. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating thing, and I don't know. I don't have the answer to it yet. I don't know if I ever will, but we have to address larger issues like artificial intelligence and climate change ahead of these petty sectarian essentialist things, because if we don't, I don't think we're going to survive. And I'd much rather survive. I want to survive, and I want to love my neighbors.
And you shouldn't have to, pick one of those.
Yeah.
I feel like one of the things that I heard there was, like we started talking about the list and the idea of this definition and staying true to this definition, and like where do Southeastern people fit within this like calcified definition of what is Indigenous. And I felt when you said that, my first thought was like, is the definition that we have expansive enough? And then the other thing that I was thinking when you were talking, I really like the term brackish people. I felt that was good. That was like, it resonated with me. And then I heard that I just keep on thinking about what you said earlier. You said like we're spiritual entities in a human experience. And, I'm thinking about that term, and I'm looking at my question list. And one of the questions that we have is, what is your own sense of Indigenous personal identity? And I guess now that I heard you say spiritual entities in human experiences, and in like this concept of identity politics, my question is like, is there such thing as like Indigenous spiritual identity, or or is it just a personal identity, or how do you reconcile the physical with the spiritual, and how do you talk about your sense of indigeneity within that?
A long time ago, these medicine people did not call themselves indigenous. They called themselves human beings. If you look at the names of all of our tribes, they mean human being, that the people were human beings. And they lived in relationship with the living spirit. They lived in relationship with it. And it was alive in the moment that they were with it. And that's how it still is. That's how it still is. And so you can become as calcified in following a spiritual path if it's not alive in the moment. It doesn't matter if it's an indigenous spiritual path, or if it's Catholicism, or if it's Kundalini yoga, or whatever, like whatever it is that you're doing, if you're doing it in the past and you're in the present, the spirit is not alive in it, but the spirit is alive in everything. It's a moving, this universe that we live in is conscious, it's alive, and we are part of that consciousness. And that is how I perceive those old, like, I've been very fortunate to have been in ceremony with a lot of elders who came from a generation that still saw the world that way. And they didn't care who came to a ceremony, because they may have recognized, I'm this way and this is what my grandpa and grandma taught me, and you didn't grow up that way. But they saw that you were a spirit living in a human body. Or that's one way to look at it. and they never locked the doors to their ceremonies, and they learned how to love people despite whatever happened. And if someone, their worst enemy, came to them and said, I need your help, they did it. They prayed for them. That's how it is. That's how it is. And so I feel hurt when I hear not just an indigenous person, but any person get caught up in these kind of like post-structuralist and postmodernist ideas, because it's not real. It's not real. There's no, it's just thoughts. It's abstractions that are put together, and the spirit's going to move through that too, but it's not anything that creates categories is not real, because the spirit just moves through things. And that's how if when a real medicine person says a prayer, they, the way I heard it, the way I had an experience of it, it just, that spirit is alive inside of it. And it's alive inside of our technology. It's alive inside of whatever, however we go, when we move to Mars, when we move to, maybe we're going to move into the internet. I don't know. You know what I mean? Whatever is happening, whatever is happening, however, our relationship to the minerals changes, because that's what it is. These computers, they're minerals that have started to think. And our relationship to the minerals is changing, and so however that changes, however we move, wherever we move to, however it is that our 7 generations from now, or 20 generate, whatever it is, however our little bitty grandbabies way off when are living, the spirit is going to be alive in that. And that's where we need to go, is wherever that living spirit is taking us, because it's never going to go back to how it was. And so however people are together, that's where we need to be together, present, learning how to forgive one another, learning how to love one another, learning how to share food and stay alive together with one another.
I know we want to talk a little bit about community in the next few questions, but I had one more question based on your answer here. Of like, one thing that I heard was you speaking about there are ways that spirits move through people, and that the way that spirits maybe used to move, if you're living in a past movement, you're not like living in the present. I'm sorry, I'm really appreciating what you're saying. I'm having a difficult time. I'm understanding and listening to it, and I'm having a hard time communicating it. But what I'm hearing is that, something that may have, been a good, a spiritual place in the past may not currently be your spiritual place, nothing else changing, but the spirit's no longer moving through that. I'm wondering within your own life, like, what are the places where you've felt movement, or that you've put action to movement, and how did you feel that, and what were the things that you did?
Thank you for asking the question. And it's not that, I think that the spirit's alive in everything, always. But if you say that, if you're in the, I'm in the middle of New York City, I'm on the top of a skyscraper, so I don't have a relationship with the earth. It's not true. You do. It's just that it's different. And so you have to intercept the spirit there in its own way, the way that it's there. And so that's what I'm trying to say. It's not that it's not there, but I'm saying that, you know, people can get lost in saying, well, they did it that way back when, and we got to do it this way now, and this is how it is, and blah 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 blah. Or you can say, you know, on the other hand, you can say, I'm indigenous, or I'm this, or I'm that, or I'm, you know, whatever. It's trying to, you know, it's like trying to pinpoint things down to this is who I am, and this is how it is, and this is, you know, you can really get lost in there when the spirit it's a flowy thing. It's alive, it's moving,
Do
and
you
you have to move with it.
do you
So if I, so,
oh
go
sorry,
ahead, I'm sorry.
sorry.
Well, I wanted to answer your question from earlier, which is like, how do you do that? So we live in the 21st century. So like, for instance, I practiced Kundalini yoga because um, I need a way to stay healthy, right? Like, and I got really intense on it during the quarantine because I was sequestered into a room looking at Zoom calls all day long. And it was a way for me to deepen my spiritual practice, um, and to like not go crazy locked up in a room, right? And and also I have, like I mentioned earlier, I have some autoimmune issues. So it's like and I think a lot of it is that our nervous systems haven't caught up to being with computers all day long. So Kundalini yoga, um, you know, the person that brought that to the West, and the way that he worked with that, you know, he understood that we were going to be having these kind of challenges in the time that we're living in now. And so he shared these methods so that we could kind of upgrade our nervous systems to the technological era that we're living in. Because I think that people are living through what he called, um, he called it megawatt information syndrome. And he said that we were going to have all of the information in the world on a little box. He said this in the 80s. His name was Yogi Bhajan. A controversial figure, I know. But he said that um, all the information in the world were going to be on little boxes that we held, and that these boxes were going to know us better than we knew ourselves. And that we were going to subconsciously know that they knew us better than ourselves, and we weren't going to feel very good about it. And that was going to cause a symptom called cold depression. And so he gave meditations for overcoming cold depression and megawatt information syndrome, as he called it. And so I find those yogic technologies very useful to me because I can function as a human being and use technology. So no matter what your religious background is, or lack of religious background, or whatever it is, you know, we live, in other words, this is what I'm trying to say. You can have an indigenous spiritual practice, and it can be wonderful for you. It can solve a lot of things. But then you walk out of that ceremony and you get into your automobile, which is run by petroleum, and you drive home, and you go home and you interact with this technology, and you know that those are factors that did not exist when those ceremonies were part of the fabric of life. So how do we resolve that? You know, we have to have ways to acknowledge who we were and to stay close to the things that make us who we are. But we also have to have technologies spiritual technologies and mental technologies that allow us to exist in this technological era that we're moving into. Because by the time our children are our age and older, they're going to be living in an age where they're interacting with artificial intelligences that are way smarter than the ones that we're working with now. And we have to have ways to cope with that. I was talking to the poet C.A. Conrad the other day, who's he's a really good friend of mine and really forward thinking person. And he was telling me he's really investigates drones. And he was talking to me about these drones that are called the Hive. And what they do is, the cops say, they tell the Hive the name of a person and the last thing that they said online, and they let them loose into a city. And it's these little tiny drones, and they go and search. They search, through all of these different databases that are being collected of us all the time. They find a person and they surround them, and then the cops show up. That's the era that we're moving into. You know what I mean? Already, we're being surveilled so much by these artificial intelligences, and nobody knows what's going on.
It seems like we almost like there's a point where we need to establish, like right now, this relationship that we have with technology seems to just be kind of happenstance or ad hoc. But like what I'm hearing is that it needs to be more intentional, and we need to describe and create a relationship with technology that's a little bit more just less laissez-faire about things and more moving in.
Yeah, and I think that that's the contribution that indigenous people have, and especially mixed race indigenous people, is that I feel like we, like, Louisiana people are already kind of like a mix. So we can bring our indigenous ingenuity about relationships and relationality into the larger world. And I think that if you just look at Creole people and indigenous people in Louisiana, that's what we've already done. Like, how your grandma sweeps the house, how, like, they do it maybe differently than some, like some person whose family's entirely English or whatever, whatever it is. I'm saying that there's like an indigenous intelligence that has been brought into the world, and that we can use our indigenous ingenuity to figure out how to establish new relationships. But we shouldn't be held back by, like, this is how you do things and this is how it was way back when, because we have to figure out how to adapt to this very strange time that we're moving into.
Yeah. You said something there that was interesting that I want to like see if we can expound upon in a few questions. You said the word we. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, like, who is we to you, and like who is your we, and what is your community, and who are they?
Oh, I get fussed at for saying we a lot, because I say it often. I'm not saying you're fussing at me. I'm just saying I do get fussed at for saying that. So it's something I'm maybe working on.
I just wanted to
But
know.
yeah, no. I think for me, we is I have a lot of we's. I feel like connected to all Creole people who I think are an indigenous community. I feel connected. I feel like I'm a Louisiana Indian. I feel like I'm an Attakapaw. I feel like I'm an indigenous person. I feel like I am part of the web of all people on this continent. I feel like I'm a queer person. I feel like I am I think I'm a little blue ball of spiritual light, like every other human being on the planet and every life form in the universe. And I guess my we kind of shifts around depending upon the context of what I'm talking about, but ultimately, I think I'm a little blue ball of light that when you when our eyes see one another, we see this thing that we okay, that's a body, and we see it moving, and we think it's real. But the reality, in my opinion, the reality is that we are beautiful spiritual entities that are connected to everything in the since the beginning of the cosmos into this kind of quantum level where we're just part of a great flow of beautiful energy, and you can call it spiritual or you can call it whatever however you want to describe it. We're part of something completely magnificent, and so that's what I think we are. That's what I think we is we're beautiful, quantumly entangled, spiritual. We're kind of like particle and wave. Like we're particles in the sense that I'm an Eshok particle, I'm a Creole particle, but I'm part of the wave of existence, and that's what I am.
Mhm.
That's what we are, in my opinion. Maybe that sounds kind of crazy, but
Well, I mean, my other question is like, do you feel like, did you feel like these were parts of like yourself that you've uncovered along the way? Or do you feel like I want to know I'm curious about the relationship about these particles within yourself and your self-realization that they were there. Do you feel like, is it like a thought of like, how you're learning to express them better, or is it just kind of like points of discovery where you're discovering that you're parts of these communities and these groups, or even thinking about it like that?
I mean, I think the typical answer is that um, let me see how to say it. I mean, I think that all of these things have come about through me deciding to make relationships and maintain relationships. Like for instance, Jeffrey, who's on the call, is part of the Attack by Eshok community. We became friends about 10 years ago or whatever it is, and we did a lot of work together. We went to a ceremony a long time ago together, and we said to each other that we wished that somebody could speak Ishikoi again. And so we established a friendship with one another, and through that friendship, things started moving, and we found linguists who were working on that language. And now there is a revised dictionary of that language. And so I think that when it comes to any sort of community that anyone's involved in, it really depends on like investing in friendship and investing time and energy into making and maintaining relationships, and having visions for how communities can grow and change and become things that they already are and that you want them to become. Um, and I think that there's like in Louisiana, there's an incredible movement among young indigenous people to publicly express things that tribes and groups of people have been unable to publicly express, and to reestablish uh, reestablish relationships among people that used to have to be really, you used to have to be really quiet about, or that, you know, used to be kind of like hush hush little secrets that were kept in families. And now they're coming more out into the open because people won't put up with them not being out in the open anymore.
Could you give me an example?
Um,
If it's appropriate.
yeah, no, I mean, I think that just, you know, like just the language work that the Atakapa Ishak Nation is doing, um, you know, nobody knew that, pretty much nobody knew we existed a few years ago, but now that just a few of us are publishing things and talking about the fact that there is a, you know, we're not an extinct tribe, um, you know, that, I think that's an example. I mean, I have seen, I'm not any kind of an expert on the United Homa Nation, but the work that I see people from the United Homa Nation doing just is incredible to me, in my opinion. I I uh, I know that there was a, Ido invited me last year, right before the quarantine, to some kind of a big, like, family reunion, you know, tribal reunion. I can't remember exactly what it was, but I
Passive.
just see, yeah, and I mean, just, you know, when I was growing up, you know, nobody, if you, I knew a few Homa people. Nobody ever referred to Homa people as being Muskogean people back then, or at least in public.
Mhm.
That was never talked about. And now there's this kind of like Muskogean reemergence in from what I can see among the Homa. And so, and there's like an acknowledgement that, you know, that tribe is like all of these groups of, my understanding is like there's all of these tribes kind of got together and became the Homa. Like, that's so beautiful to me that that's being spoken about, and that, um, you know, all that old ceremonies are coming back. You know, I met a Yuchi man at a peyote ceremony in Oklahoma who told me about, at some point, going down and sharing a stomp dance with with a Homa family. Um, and so I just think those kinds of things are so beautiful, that people have the intelligence and people have the desire to understand those things. And I think it just, you know, that it's a popular word to say, indigenous resilience. But I just think that it's more than indigenous resilience. It's like the life force inside of all of us is so strong that there are certain things that are gone. It's like you can mow a yard and it's gonna grow back. And that's what's happening. And I think that it's beautiful to see it happening. And I love that it's allowed to grow back in the 21st century. And I think that the way things are going to grow back in the 21st century is just, it's different, and it's okay, and it's good. The How things come back, it's good.
Yeah.
It's
Well, I'm
good.
thinking of like things coming back. I'm thinking about the Ishikoi language and kind of the work with that. What do you want to talk a little bit more about your relationship with the Ishikoi language?
Sure. I don't speak it, but I Jeffrey and I, like I was mentioning, and, you know, through our work with the Ishak Tribal Council, um, you know, we have a group of people that, when we're able to get together and work on it, um, I wish I had more time to put into it, but I do what I can. I do what I can with it, but I'm very, very grateful that I've had the opportunity to kind of like help light the spark to see that unfold.
Yeah.
It's one of those things that somebody could like dedicate their entire life to making that happen.
Yeah.
But I mean, for myself, I have, I'm getting a degree. I'm doing all these things, so I only have so much energy that I can devote to it. But we work with a couple of amazing linguists, Justin Southworth and David Kaufman is the person that's like a linguist that's put a lot of labor of love into it. And when we started, there were just Gashett and Schwanten had put together a dictionary like they did for a lot of tribal languages from all the way across the Gulf of Mexico. And so that's pretty much what we had. No one understood how the grammar worked in the language. So now, in my opinion, the big contribution is that these linguists have pretty much figured out how the grammar works. And the basics of that are in the first edition of the dictionary. And my understanding is that in the second edition, there's going to be a greater explanation of how the grammar works. And in my opinion, even more important than that is that tribal members have agreed upon how to spell certain words, how to say certain words. So there's a contribution from people in the tribe to how the language is going to be represented in the future. And I think that's seriously important, because it's not just a couple of linguists deciding this kind of thing for us.
Look together.
Yeah. And I think, more important, I mean, for me, more important than that, there are places that when I'm in Louisiana, I go to where villages used to be and where our spirits live. And if I say some of those words, they remember the language, they know the language. The eagles show up out of nowhere if you call them in that language. And the birds show up, the alligators show up. Those ones know, they understand the patterns of those sounds. And it doesn't matter how long it's been since someone's spoken them, when those sound currents come out into the world from the body of a person and mind, heart, spirit of a person, and you say them, those spirits come. They come. And that's the real thing, if you ask me.
I feel like that's an intercept point, where language is being used or language is not being used, but language is an intercept point, and that's just, the overall, relationship world. I'm wondering, for you, what are some other intercept points within Ishikoi culture? So it sounds like, using language in visiting places is what I just heard is like, something that deeply connects into something. I'm wondering, I'm mostly curious, wondering if there's a place where like you mentioned earlier about native church, and if that's an intercept point for you, or your writing, or, or one of the earliest things that you said was that you don't necessarily write poetry as much as poetry writes through you and kind of your music and things like that.
Trying to intercept points. Well, right now I'm writing a children's book that um, is going to introduce the 6 clan animals of of the Takapa Ishak Nation. Um, and so the story, this right now, the way that it's being written is that it's about a character named Old Blackjack, who is me, and Blackjack is taking his 4 niece and nephews to Lake Martin, and um, at Lake Martin, Blackjack is introducing his niece and nephews to those 6 spirits that are the animals that are there and where a village used to be and where mounds are. Um, and those clan animals, they live right there by our village. The only one that you may not see anymore very often is like a black panther, even though I still think they're there. But when you go there, those are our clan animals are there. That's where they live. They live there. And so the words, the cosmology, the actual animals, the land, they're all together with one another. They live together. And so they are together. They're in relationship to one another. And so um, that I'm using that little book so that my sister will read the book, and so that she will learn those 6 words. And then also, like, as a tribe, we have to decide, like, okay, we know these are the animals, but in some cases there are 4 different words for a snake, for instance. Like, which one, we don't know which one we should use, because nobody has spoken the language since 1932. So when we refer to the snake as that is the clan animal, which word do we use, right? So like it's a way that's an intercept point. It brings people together. Just the word, just that spirit is bringing people together to say, we think it should be this one, you know. So that's the power that's inside of those words. And I think that those words, they came from the earth. Maybe they came from outer space. I don't know. You know what I mean? A lot of people believe that about, you know what I mean? Maybe that's how they came to us. But um, just that snake, just that alligator, just that eagle, its existence and the way it wants to be spoken to brings people together. And all it took was one thought to make those relationships come together. And also, I want to acknowledge my late uncle. He's an adopted Navajo uncle. His name was Edmund Chickarillo. He died of COVID, but in 2014, we brought him an arrow because that was a way, traditional Eshok way, to make a relationship with someone. I brought him actually a gourd in the Native American church, a gourd rattle. Used to be an arrow. They put a gourd on the top of that stick where the arrow was so that the fighting would stop. So that was the arrow that I brought to him. And I asked him to run a Native American church ceremony. And in that ceremony, I asked for our language to come back. And a few months after that ceremony happened, I moved back to Louisiana and I became a part of the tribal council. And it was through that prayer that was said. So I want to thank all Navajo people and all their traditional ways and the way that they use that ceremony for helping our language to come back. And in that ceremony, they told me things in the charcoals. They saw how we used alligators. Every time I have that a Navajo medicine person has done a ceremony on me, they see things about alligators. And they knew that, you know, one of them said, y'all used to make arrowheads out of alligator scales. And it's true, that's true. And they, you know, so my opinion is too that you know, I was kind of talking about being alive in the moment, but the technology of indigenous ceremony has the you know, a fire. We can look at a fire and trust it. We can trust what a fire tells us, what we see in the side of a fire. And so all it's kind of like you know, in one of those Star Wars shows, you remember Yoda blows up the Jedi temple. He calls the lightning down or whatever and blows up the original Jedi teachings and says that young girl, that she has it in the force inside of her, that's all she needs. That's how this is for all of our communities in Louisiana. It's inside of us. It's inside of us. It's inside of our fireplaces. It's inside of the geometries that we use, you know, like the counterclockwise motion around a stomp dance, or the clockwise motion around a ceremony, a different ceremony, whatever it is. The energy of who we are is inside of these things, inside of fire, inside of water, inside of when we burn an herb, inside of when we talk to the air. The answers that we need about who we are inside of those things. And that's all we just need to trust them and move with the spirit, and these things come into being. And I think that our dictionary is an example of that. We had a thought, Jeffrey and I had a thought, we went to a ceremony together, we projected that thought into the ceremony. I ended up in New Mexico, a ceremony was said, and that prayer brought a dictionary together, and now there's a few people who are kind of speaking Ishak. And so that's my encouragement to indigenous communities that have been decimated. It's inside of you. Look at a fire, light a fire, look at it, look at the coals. That's the original internet. That's the original World Wide Web. And the truth is written on those charcoals, and you can find it and do it and make it real.
You know, I'm thinking about, you know, part of this interview process is we want to make this publicly available, and we want this interview to like answer some questions that people might have. And I feel like I've learned so much about indigenous, or like your spirituality and like your worldview, and I feel like that's been super helpful for me in my path. So I really appreciate your time. I'm so like another thing that's, you know, that these interviews are trying to do is, you know, is kind of do an AMA, or an Ask Me Anything. So I know that that Ida and Jeffrey probably have some questions about stuff that we haven't covered yet, but I wanted to think about and put on the hat of, you know, an audience member in the future who might be listening to this, and ask a few questions about that. I guess the first question is like, how often are you asked to speak about your Indigenous background? Is that like something that you know, you find yourself constantly, you know, discussing in public, or is this something that you don't necessarily discuss, or like, what is your relationship to that question?
I've made a decision before this interview to say more than I normally do in public, because I think right now, because of things like the list and because of the stuff that I mentioned when I was talking about that, I think it's time for us to just be open. I think we have to just talk. I've held back a lot in public because you know, part of the reason I feel comfortable doing this is that it's specifically about us as Louisiana Native people. Um, you know, I think that a lot of times I try to make space for people who are from federally recognized tribes or who are quote unquote, you know, I hate thinking about life this way, but you know, quote unquote full-blooded people or whatever. I want to make space for them because in a lot of ways in the larger dialogue, um, they have a lot to say and they have a lot to lose. And I want to acknowledge and respect that. And give them the room, and it also gives me freedom to do what I want. You know what I mean? Like I don't want to be held back. But I don't want to live my life pretending that I just like walking around with a feather or something. You know, I want to do what I want to do. um so yeah, I do speak about it. I do speak about it in public. um You know, I still work as an organizer for an LGBTQ organization in Arizona. It's called Equality Arizona. Um, and so let me tell you what I do. More so than speaking about being Indigenous, I spend a lot of time making space for Indigenous people.
Mm, mm, yeah.
Um, One thing I do is through my job, I run a queer poetry salon. Um, and at first it started out just being like, you know, local Arizona poets, but we work with the Virginia Piper Center at ASU. They give us a bunch of money and we bring in queer poets from like the best queer poets in the world. And um, I always have, I always make room for Indigenous poets. We've had several all Indigenous queer poetry readings. And I think that that's super important, or I find it to be super important, is just like a lot of times I don't want to be the one speaking for Indigenous people, but I will make room for Indigenous people to speak.
Mm,
Um, Because you know what? There's Indigenous people all over the world, a lot of different kinds. Um, I think we need to make room for quote unquote Latino, Latinx, Hispanic, Chicano, Chicanx, however people decide to describe that. Many of them are Indigenous people. A lot of Creole people are Indigenous people. A lot of people in South America are Indigenous people. I mean, in all corners of the world are Indigenous people, and um, I try to think beyond abstract national borders when I think about indigeneity.
makes sense.
So,
What do you find, like, you know, one thing that you just mentioned is that you're more, you know, you made an intentional point in this interview to be more open than you normally would. I know there's a few topics we haven't gotten to yet that I'd really like to cover, but in thinking about that, and you know, you made a thought that you were going to be intentionally more open. I'm thinking, you know, someone who's listening may want to know, like, what's the boundary of, you know, in normal conversations that you feel like uncomfortable, or you feel like this is too much, or people are pressing too much about this topic with you personally?
um, this is the first time that in person I've ever talked about the traitors in my family. Um, Mainly because I don't think that it's supposed to be advertised. Like I'm not trying to advertise it. You know what I mean? I'm not trying to like get business because I would never charge for that in the first place. But I think that as we move into this new era that we're moving into, there's certain things that are going that we like, if you don't speak about them, they're going to be lost. And so I felt like, since I right now I'm saying I am speaking to indigenous people in Louisiana. That's who I'm speaking to in this interview. I know other people will listen to it, but I am speaking to indigenous people in Louisiana. And so I wanted to talk about that because I think it's an important part of who we are. And I've also been trying in private to speak to federally recognized indigenous people about that part of my history, not to try to like brag or anything, but so that they can understand that we have medicine people in my family. Like, you can't deny me that. You know what I mean? Like, you can try, but it's there. And so I feel like it's important. I feel like it's kind of, that has been a line for me. Like, talking about ceremony has been a line for me, just because I want to respect the ceremony, and also because I'm not federally recognized. It's dangerous for various reasons, but I feel protected, so I'm talking about it. um, but I think that, I do think that there is this notion that, like, I hear people when they say, oh, it's not my job to educate people and all that kind of stuff, but maybe it is. Maybe it is our job to educate people. Maybe not all the time. Maybe we should be compensated for it. I just think that that whole conversation is kind of baloney, right? But we I think that it's good to talk about these things sometimes, and I guess I feel more mature as a human being and more ready to just say, look, I'm this person, this is my background, this is the truth of it. I'm not trying to hide. I'm not going to tell you I grew up any kind of certain way. I'm not going to try to make nothing up about myself. This is how I grew up. This is what I did. This is what I like I go to ceremony, I go to Kundalini yoga. No, I'm not a new age guru, but like, you know what I mean? Like, there's all these ways that people try to pin you down. Like, if you like ceremony and you like Kundalini yoga, maybe you're a new age guru. Or maybe if you're native and you're this, you're that. Like, I want to try to just be open. I'm trying in this interview to be open about myself, because I think that in the 21st century, nobody is going to be a perfect anything. We're all going to be, like, you can be an indigenous person who likes Japan anime. You can be an indigenous person who makes hip hop. You can be, you know what I'm saying? Like, we live in the time of the ultimate mashup,
Yeah.
and it's good.
So on that
Good.
kind of the opposite side of that same question is, what are some things that you feel like, you would want to express or talk about, or when someone, approaches you and has questions about, your indigeneity, what are some topics where you're like, gee, I really would like to let more people know about this?
Uh-huh. You know what? I came home and I bought this car from my dad, and I was driving around listening to 88.7 in Lafayette on Saturday morning. And there's those two guys, I don't know their names, but maybe you can find it and put it in the transcript or something. But it's those two dudes that play Zydeco music on Saturday mornings. And we had, there's a historian, Hugh Singleton, who wrote the Indians who invented Zydeco or whatever. And I know that my understanding is Homa people used to do this with alligators too. That they you know, they take the alligator and they make kind of a zither or whatever you it was a percussion instrument where you'd move a stick along the scales of the alligator. I've seen one that was made by a Homo person, right? But Eshok people definitely did this, and they would wear it. And it was, they'd take the scales of the alligator, and it was a percussion instrument, and that's where the washboard, using a washboard as a musical instrument, came from.
No way! Wow, no idea.
Yeah. And way back when, we used to make water drums that were about 6 foot long. It was, you'd take a hollowed out log, and they would dig about a 3-foot hole in the ground. And they'd put that water drum log inside of that hole, and they could communicate with one another from about 150 miles off through that water drum. And where they got it from was the alligator, because when an alligator, male alligator, is in the water, they get on top of the water and they shake and they make that sound. And that's how they communicate where their territory is and whatever else is that they say when they're in the water like that. And so it's observation of the spirits that we had relationships with that gave us those things. And that's inside of Zydeco now. You know, that's inside of this music. And if you listen to stomp dance music and you listen to the blues, I mean, God, it's the same thing.
Yeah.
And so when I come home, what I hear is indigenous futurism all around me. It was like 18th century indigenous futurism, you know, that's like the culture that we live in now. 18th and 19th century Afro-indigenous futurism. And, you know, like Bugs Bunny that influenced the entire United States, it's Brer Rabbit. It's this rabbit, you know, and our trickster gods were that rabbit that kind of is going against capitalism or whatever, and Bugs Bunny, you know, like. And so that is like Afro-indigenous futurism from, I mean, I know that like white people took it and made the show, right? But our spirit communicated through those mediums.
Wow.
And so when I hear, yeah, so when I hear Zydeco, like when I was listening to that Zydeco in the car the other day, that's what I was thinking about. When I see the intelligence of our ancestors expressing themselves through how life is here in Louisiana. It found a way to express itself regardless of what happened. And as we move into, you know, I was in a ceremony the other day in Navajo country, and they were talking, someone in there, I mean, I'm not speaking for any Navajo or anything like that, but they were talking about their, you know, they believe that they've been through several worlds. And they were talking about how they felt, this one medicine man was talking about how he felt that the COVID-19 pandemic was kind of the portal through which we moved into this new world. And I really resonated with that, you know, like we are kind of in a new world. We have to trust that our indigenous intelligence is going to find a way to express itself in this new world. And it may not look exactly like it used to look, but the spirit is going to find a way to express itself. And so that's what I'm really excited about. That's what I want to be part of. You know, that's what I want people to know about.
Something that you mentioned earlier, and I just want to make sure that we get this point clear, because I really want to make sure that these interviews are going directly to the people that you guys think are most should definitely hear them. Earlier, you mentioned that, you know, as you're talking today, who you're really talking to are Indigenous people within Louisiana. Are you hoping that Indigenous people from Louisiana are able to hear this recording or hear your interview?
Oh yeah, I want my haters to hear this interview, and I want people from Louisiana to hear this interview. I want my niece and nephews to hear this interview. Um, and I want, I want, like T-Boy down the street in Louisiana to hear this interview too, right? So that he doesn't think that he owns this place. You know, he's just kind of like a little aberration with a purple and gold flag on the back of his truck, as far as I'm concerned. So I want him to hear me say that too. But um, but I want to, and I want to I want to say how beautiful I think it all is. I want to, I want to say how beautiful I think it all is. And I was, when I was coming home, I flew in the other day, back home. I'm in Louisiana at the time of the interview. And when we went up into the air, it had been the first time that I flew in a while, definitely since the pandemic, but it had been a couple years before that since I flew. And as we went into the air, I opened the window and I was trying to talk to the clouds. And I was trying to be in relationship with the clouds in Arizona, and I was talking to them, expressing my gratitude for the water that, I was asking them to bring rain and that kind of a thing, because there's no rain there. And then when we got back, I felt so good when I saw how the sky looks. I was up in the air, and we have such a beautiful sky here in Louisiana, the beautiful colors in the sky, beautiful clouds in the sky, the way that the water comes from the Gulf, the way that it, no matter what's going on in the Gulf right now, the way that the water comes, everybody says water goes down, it goes up too. And it's up there. And I was so happy to be in that kind of beauty, and when we came down into the airport in Lafayette, the way that the trees look here, it's so beautiful. It's so beautiful. And it made me, even just thinking about it, I feel it right here, how beautiful it is here. And that, no matter what happens, even if we lose even if all of it gets eroded away through climate change, and it's always been happening, the spirit is alive in the changes that are happening. The spirit's alive in all of it. And I just think I want the people who hear this to know how beautiful I think it all is, and to be happy. I want them to be happy. And I want them to hear that a Louisiana Indian is saying, be happy, get along with one another, and look around you, see how beautiful this place is. And even other people, other types of people who might not consider themselves indigenous, somewhere along the line, they came from Neanderthals, they came from whoever they came from the earth. And the intelligence of the earth is expressing itself through them. And I think that's very, very beautiful.
When we're thinking about the 21st century and that beauty, could you describe what gives you hope?
What do I hope? Um, I hope, yes, okay. Right now in the United States, there's this kind of polarity happening. There's a major polarization happening. We all know about it. Everybody's very concerned about it. On the one hand, we have this kind of like move towards fascism on the right, and on the left, there's, it's that all the good intentions are moving into a sort of other kind of negative territory, in my opinion. And the my hope is that we can instead of trying to go this way or that way, that we can raise our vibration above the polarity that's taking place in this country. And, like there's an artificial talk about unity on both sides, because the unity that they're going for is based on some kind of like polarity, like we have to be all the way on this side or we have to be all the way on this side. I think my hope is for a new kind of sharing that is that respects individuality, and that is open to the kind of new collectivity that is possible and has never been possible on the earth until we had the internet. And so that's what I'm hoping for, that we learn how to respect one another in a new kind of way. And my hope is that instead of focusing on the trauma, that we focus on what we want in this world. Because every time we focus on trauma, that's what we get more of.
Mm.
And every time we focus on getting along with one another, and every time we focus on creating the world that we want to live in, that's what we get more of. So my hope is for creativity and not deconstruction. My hope is for that we learn how to create together and share together, be respectful of one another, and that life on this planet goes on for a long, 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 long time.
What type of world do you want to leave behind for like your niece and nephew and the future generations, if you can kind of manifest a vision of that?
I'm already doing my part. I'm doing it. I'm 123%. I might not be very rich, but maybe, I don't care. I'm making it. And I want them to make it. It's not about, for me, what it's gonna look like. It's about being alive in it and doing it. I wanted to write poetry. I became a poet. I wanted to see this dictionary come out. There's a dictionary. I wanted to learn how to do this and that. I did it. And that's my hope for my niece and nephews and future generations, that when they have a vision, they just go out and do it. And that's how to be, to me, that's how to be an indigenous person in the world. When I went to ceremonies, that's what they said. They said, just do it. Don't fall asleep, just pay attention, be in the moment. There's some ceremonies, they say, don't take your shoes off, because you never know when you're going to need to. I think it's from the days when, you used to get, the cops used to show up at the ceremony, or the next tribe would come over and burn your ceremony down. You have to be ready to get up and go. We got to be ready to get up and go. And in this world with climate change and with artificial intelligence and with the police states and all this stuff, we got to be able to get up and go. Got to be ready. I want future generations to be present. I want them to have healthy nervous systems. I want there to be more focus on people's physical health, on the food that they eat being healthy food to eat, and for people to have healthy nervous systems. Instead of focusing on racism, I want people to focus on healing post-traumatic stress. Instead of focusing on all these, I want people to, all the things that people focus on because of broken nervous systems and post-traumatic stress. I want people to fix their nervous systems and their post-traumatic stress so that we're healthy, present, and alive in the moment. And we can live healthily in this new time that we're moving into. Because imagine this, what would activism, what would all these things look like if we were healthy?
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. It's resonating.
And I'm not
It's
I'm
resonating.
not trying to be ableist by saying that or whatever people would say these days. I'm just saying, like, I want people to focus on health. I want people to be able to eat blueberries and plant corn without a government entity saying they own it, or that you can't eat a blueberry, or that you can't drink raw milk.
Yeah.
That's
Another
what I hope.
another part of this project is, allowing individuals to have more control over their identity. And so, the question that we've kind of just been kind of talking about the entire time, but never really addressing is like, how would you like to be portrayed? Or,
How would I like to be portrayed? I don't care. I don't care. I'm secure inside of myself, and I don't have any control over how someone else portrays me. You know what I mean? I really don't. I can, but I'm more concerned about how I portray myself. And I want to portray, I'd rather say that I want to portray myself in a good way. I want for people who might have a different, might come to me, they're thinking, oh, all kinds of things about me. When they come and meet me, they can make their own opinion about it. And how I project myself is going to be something good, and they might surprise themselves about it. You know what I mean? So how anybody else says it, that's up to them.
I feel like there's 3 or 4 more topics that I'd love to get your questions on. I know we're I don't know what time it is, but been at this for a while. Are you good, or do you need a break? Or
I'm good. I'm ready. I booked off till 3 o'clock, so I'm ready to go.
Oh, cool. All right.
I did want to give a chance for Jeffrey and Ida. They've been listening this whole time. Do you guys want to pop in with some questions you might have?
I had a couple. Tanner, you had mentioned making music, and you mentioned your poetry writing practice. I often wonder about this sort of myself, because as you know, I also make music and I also publish poetry. But when you're working in, sometimes I mean, indigenous people have always had some sort of poetry and music, but sometimes like the ways that things get published or recorded or instrumentation, whatever, is not necessarily the original instrumentation or the original forms. Can you speak to that some sort of way? Like there seems to be pressure sometimes on indigenous artists to do artwork that people associate with indigenous people, sort of like beadwork or traditional
Right.
dancing. Can you speak about what makes an art form indigenous, or what's your relationship to art forms that are sometimes non-indigenous in their original formation, but that indigenous people such as yourself use? I know it's kind of a theoretical question, but it's something I was thinking about while you were talking.
It's a good question. I think that there's definitely a lot of pressure from for instance, in poetry. I know that there's a lot, I think it's changing, but there's been a lot of pressure from publishers that they've got to sell a book. And so they've got to, they want, um, I've heard before from different people talking about how they write this book, and then the way that the publisher sells it is they put like a feather or something on the front of the book, and then you know what I mean. And it's like, oh, then now the person knows it was an Indian that made that book. And I don't, I heard this. I was in this workshop that this Dene poet and fiction writer Manny Lally did the other day. And look, if you want to learn about an indigenous people that are really making something, is the Navajo people are really doing something in the literary world. They even come up with something called Denetics, like Dene aesthetics. And there's a number of them that are working at Dene College. Like, instead of going off to big universities, they've decided to work at Dene College. And Dene College, even how their building is structured is based on, to my understanding, on Navajo cosmology. And so I think that I was okay. So in this workshop that Manny Lally was giving, he played a snippet of a video that Rexley Jim, who's a Navajo poet, did at the University of Texas. You can watch it on YouTube. And in the video, Rexley Jim writes poetry in Denebizad, and in English and Denebizad. But it's pretty revolutionary to write poetry in Navajo in the United States. So he sang a song in this video that he said that he made it up. He made the song up, but it kind of copies some of the traditional Dene ceremonial songs, but he kind of wanted to give an impression of like how language is used in these ceremonial songs, and how poetry could be derived from that. So I think that, like, on the one hand, it's possible to turn back, like, for instance, Rain Prudhomme Cranford has done some work where she's written some poetry that are based on the call and response of stomp dance songs. So I think that you can derive forms by looking back upon traditional ceremonial forms. Another thing that's happening a lot in indigenous poetry is using cartographies using the four directions, using different sort, even like using maps of regions as a source of like a source of form because of connectivity to land base. So I think that there's a lot of ways to, I think there's a lot of ways to transpose, like for instance, like using a map to get a form, a poetic form. That's something that you could say, well, like an abstract expressionist painter would have done something like that. So, like using something from a contemporary form to harken back to an indigenous ideology and to create a new indigenous form. But then you have someone like Tommy Pico, the poet, who wrote Nature Poem, which is all about how nowadays, you can't write a nature poem. It's like, there's all sorts of ways to do it, but I think that, like I was saying earlier, it's just like when I listened to the Zydeco and I heard indigenous futurism inside of that Zydeco, I think that because we're indigenous people, our forms, no matter if we write a sonnet or not, it's going to be an indigenous sonnet. And I think like just trusting our indigenous intelligence, no matter what we do, it's indigenous.
Joel, for answering that question. I think most of the other stuff I was thinking of asking you about, I guess maybe one thing is, you have spent considerable amount of time living outside of Louisiana, and you have lived outside and returned and lived outside, etc. Do you, I guess, how do you feel about living in exile or outside of the homelands? I think of the people we're interviewing. I don't know if this is true. Haley, Ida, maybe you remember if this is true, but Tanner might be the only one who does not live in Louisiana. Is that correct?
I don't remember off the top of my head, but I think you're close to it. Yeah.
I mean, obviously you don't live in Louisiana either, Haley, but and Ida says they believe so. So maybe you could speak a little bit about that. And Ida also has a question in the chat, which maybe they will buzz in with.
Okay.
If you could speak about that a little bit more.
Yeah, I'll answer that question. I mean, I'm a little bit of a, well, I mean, I could say, well, I mean, I don't think people were meant to stay in one place. I mean, even way back when you used to just kind of pick up your putt and go somewhere else when you felt like it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I like to bounce around. I've learned a lot living in the West. I think that there is a kind of political and ideological density in Louisiana that I find it difficult to be around from time to time. And I don't think it has to do with the indigenous people there. I think it has to do with T-Boy and his purple and gold flag that I have a hard time with personally, which I think kind of fits into the next question about being a queer person. I came out in Louisiana in the year, what year was it? 1997. I've lived as an openly, I've called it different things, gay, whatever. At one point, I used the word non-binary, although I'll never use that word again personally. I don't have anything against it, but I don't associate with it anymore. But I I think that that has been hard for me from time to time because, I mean, even today I went to a gym here in Louisiana and I was just like, you know, it's very like 1852 or something over here sometimes, you know, like the, you know what I'm saying? Like it's really like not the 21st century in the 21st century. And um but I've I miss it. I miss the land here. But I've also I feel uh you know, living in the Southwest, for instance, you know, most of those tribes like going to ceremony there, most of them they've got taboos against reptiles and things.
Mm.
And I know that I have a relationship with alligators. I mean, even just when I go to a ceremony, they're always in the fireplaces for me. They come and visit me. And um, I, but I've learned a great deal living in from indigenous people in other parts of the country. Um, and I enjoy going to Oklahoma because there's a lot of tribes that used to live in Louisiana that live in Oklahoma, or they know things that we don't know about ourselves in Oklahoma. Some of those people, um, and I've learned a lot about them, and I don't know where my destiny is taking me. Maybe I will come home at some point, but I think that I think I've needed I think I've needed I think my humanness has needed to get out because it can be so culturally restrictive as a queer person to be in to like exist here. Um, it's hard. It's hard, you know. This and I feel like the racism in Louisiana is hard for me to deal with sometimes. I think I understand why I became a left-wing radical at one point in my life. Like, I don't really feel that way anymore, but sometimes when I come back to Louisiana, I'm like, I'm ready to fight again. You know? It's like you people, you know, but so that's my answer to that question. Okay, let me read this. Ida, do you want to say the question or do you want me to just read it? Okay. I guess I'll just read it. My question is, can you speak in a message to the queer youth, queer in sexuality, queer in general area of Native Louisiana or in LA in general, in the South in general, however you want to speak to that, but yeah, okay. I will answer that question. What do I want to say? I would say learn from the modern language about these topics, but don't get trapped in it. Learn what it's trying to show you, but also learn how it's trying to ensnare you. And the answer to all of those questions is inside of yourself, and there's not a name for it. It's what's inside of you, and it's okay. It's good. And I do think that I also want to say that I think that if you're indigenous and part of these communities, that it is good to look backwards and you know, do your best to understand how these identities may have existed in the past for indigenous people in Louisiana. And because, in my opinion, I can only speak for myself, because those identities have been interrupted, how they should express themselves now needs to be in the present tense and in the future tense, because we're never going backwards, but we can, in the same way that, you know, there's this kind of like Muskogee revival among the Homa that I was talking about earlier, but it's or whatever it is, how it's coming back, how the grass is going to grow back is going to be new, and it's going to have the 21st century in it, it's going to have the past in it, but the living spirit is going to be in it. And wherever you know inside of yourself that that is, follow it. And that's how it's going to express itself the right way, in my opinion. And everybody else needs to figure that out for themselves.
Makes sense. I have another question of a topic I feel like we've kind of talked around, but we haven't necessarily gotten to like actually describe is the process of Native church, and what's that process to you?
Well, the Native American church, it's a wonderful thing. It's a really wonderful thing. It's I mean, it's an intertribal faith nowadays. There's everyone that you talk to is going to tell you a different story about it, and I think that all those stories are true. I think that that's how these kind of things are. There's truth in every story that an indigenous person tells. So I'm not going to say which one I think is true or anything. Nowadays, I think there's a lot of, you know, a lot of indigenous people, they want to look back on the specific traditional ways of their tribe or of their family, and that's good too. I think that there's always been on a certain level a little bit of conflict between quote unquote traditionalists and Native American church people, because it is a ceremony that has, it's like, you know, in some ways it's like the ghost dance, you know, like somebody was given that vision of the ghost dance, and then it moved around from different tribes, and a lot of people picked it up and used it when it was possible to use that ceremony. And in some ways, I think that the Native American church, it really came around to a lot of tribes to rejuvenate people who were hurting and who had been affected by being colonized and put into reservations or whatever situation they went into. That church saved my life.
How so?
I was broken. I was totally a broken person, and I needed strong medicine to help me out, and I needed to I'm not recommending it for anybody. I'm just saying that for me it was a necessary thing that I got involved in. And I think that I've seen a lot of people walk into that teepee with cancer and walk out without it. And I've seen a lot of people, I was sexually abused as a kid. I had a ceremony about it, and I'm an all right person now. At the same time, I've had, because I'm mixed race and because I don't come from a federally recognized tribe, I've had hard experiences in there. I don't talk about it very much because I'm not from a federally recognized tribe and the government regulates that church. It's a beautiful ceremony. It's a beautiful, beautiful ceremony. And I feel like if that was the only gift that the Creator ever gave me, that would have been a wonderful, beautiful gift to have received. But I've been gifted with a lot of beautiful things in my life, and I hope that that ceremony is always around for people to enjoy. It's just it's a beautiful, wonderful thing. I'm not aware that it happens in Louisiana, and I've been, I know different indigenous people in Louisiana who don't like it. And that's good. That's okay. But, at one point in my life when I was living in Wabancha, I called it New Orleans back then. Uh, I, I was a spiritual person, but I did not believe in God. I did not believe, I didn't address the Creator. But I read, when I had been living in San Francisco several years before, I picked up a copy of Wallace Black Elk's, those Conversations with Wallace Black Elk. And he was a peyote roadman, and he was also a traditional Lakota. He was a traditional Lakota medicine man and a peyote roadman. And I read that book, and the way he was talking about things made a lot of sense to me. And I had two friends that died from suicide, and I found one of them dead. And I wanted to go. I didn't want to be here anymore. I was lost. And then I read what that guy had to say, and I decided to give God a try. And all I said in my little prayer was, I just said, bring love into my life or take me home. And he gave me, or God, what Creator, Atzatat, however you want to talk about it, gave me the Native American church, and that saved my life. I don't think I'd be here if I hadn't gone to that ceremony. So
You mentioned that there were people who didn't necessarily think it's a positive thing. Why is that?
well, I think some of them are just scared of anything they don't know, but I think some of them maybe just don't want another kind of ceremony coming here, or they, maybe they're Christian, or maybe they, maybe it just doesn't belong here. I don't know. But it's, I mean, Jeffrey and I went to one in Choctaw country together in Mississippi, and it fit, it worked there. It worked over there. But I just think it's an individual decision if that's what you want to do. But it's a beautiful intertribal ceremony, and through the components of it, one may revitalize things that have been lost. And there's a lot of things that could be said about that that I'm not going to say in this interview.
Another thought that I had with this is, I feel like you're a creative person with a vision towards like 21st century with a lot of thoughts around digital life, or like this new, what you called it, the opening of the digital world that, is coming to be. How do you think, and part of this, like, indigenous ingenuity is taking the things that work and translating them into new environments. So I just wonder if you have any thoughts on what the church of the future may look like, or the indigenous church of the future.
The indigenous church of the future. Hold on.
No. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, my AirPods were giving out. I apologize. I don't know. I don't know, but I think it's going to be alive. I think it'll, I think that all you got to do is, if you ever go to something from your tribe, whatever they have left, and you see how they do it today, it's good if there's sincerity in it. It's good if there's sincerity in it. You could take something from way back when and bring it and do it today, and if there's no sincerity in it, a lot of people are going to get hurt.
Mm.
In fact, almost everybody in the universe is going to get hurt. But if you take the one thing that you know and you put your full spirit and your full heart into it, and you do it right now, a lot of people are going to get helped. And so I think that whatever people are going to, and I think it's not going to look one way. I don't think it's possible to say an indigenous church of the future. I think that's going to look a lot of different ways. If you just look at, what indigenous people in Mexico, how 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 that is expressed now, like the Virgin of Guadalupe, that's an indigenous church of the future from some past that were, the God that they're really talking to there. I think it's going to look all kinds of ways, and I think it's going to work and help people when there's sincerity in it, and I think it's going to hurt everybody when there's not.
It's great
And
work.
And I want to say this too. I think if an indigenous person wants to become a Buddhist, and that's where they can put their sincerity into it, that's what they should do. If an indigenous person feels called to be a Christian or a Muslim or 4 different religions at the same time, if they're sincere about it, they can do it just the same way that anybody else can go do whatever that they want to do. That's what you know what I mean? It's just,
Yeah.
people need to be themselves.
Thank you for that. Jeffrey, Ida, any last calls on questions? Anything else?
There were a lot of, all the questions I thought of asking, Tanner managed to touch on in one way or another. So I'm not, maybe one last thing, like as an artist, well, I guess you probably answered that already, talking about indigenous, what makes a piece of art indigenous, but also like not only like genres or technology of expression, but do you feel like you yourself are tend to be pigeonholed just to one thing, like that you have to talk about?
No,
I don't know. I don't know if you, I don't know what you want to
I
say.
want to talk about it. I do want to talk about it. I'll say this. I do feel like there is a I would probably, if I wanted to write a Takapaw Creole identity politics book, I would probably win awards, and it would be easier to get into the mainstream of what's going on in poetry today. But I want to talk about the things I talked about in this interview. And I'm not going to be pigeonholed by anybody. And I think that there's always a way as an artist to, I think like let me say this, right now we're living in a time like I could make a huge audience through TikTok of like Japanese people who want to hear about what I want to write about. You know what I'm saying? Because we have like this, like you could do anything you want nowadays. Like I think that there's more opportunity for prosperity right now than any time ever on the face of the earth. I think you just have to like use the technology the right way to get the thing you want. So I think that if an artist feels that they need to follow a certain path, that they can become very constricted in opportunities, and whether it's indigenous or anybody else. But I also think that nowadays anybody can do almost anything. And so um, now that said, I think that if you bill yourself as an indigenous artist and you write about certain topics, your likelihood of encountering the firing squad is higher.
Mhm.
You know what I'm saying? So like I think that like you could, if you talk like, but my way out is to call my work speculative poetry or like sci-fi. And I think that that's why people write science fiction or fiction is so that they can say what they want and get away with it. Um, you know what I mean? So I think that I think there's just like there's always a way through every obstacle. And I think that personally, because I'm indigenous, whatever I do is going to be indigenous. And my main hero and teacher is Brer Rabbit. Because I'm serious about that. Like I've really studied those Brer Rabbit. Um, but like, do you know the ones that I'm talking about? Like the original Creole Brer Rabbit stories? Like that were transcribed from French into English. I can't remember, but I studied them a fair amount. And that little trickster rabbit figured his way through every obstacle. And so I'm going to trick my way out of every little trap that is being set for me. I hope that was an okay answer to your question.
Whatever answer you give is the okay answer. I hadn't thought about those stories in kind of a while, so I like it.
I had a lot of time to think about things in that quarantine, and um, I've kind of like surprised myself by what I've come up with, and I don't know, maybe it's just, maybe I went senile, I don't know. But
Is there anything that we haven't asked you about that you feel like you wanted to cover?
I would, I do want to say something. I would say that I want to say thank you for doing this project. I would say that my answers to these questions are probably going to be a lot different than other people who were answered them, and that I'm definitely some kind of a futurist. So, but people should take that in mind, my answers, and that they should really pay attention to what other people are saying about these topics, because they're probably more reliable answers for the present moment. Um, and I would say that I also probably agree with those things for the present moment also. Um, and that I would like to say that um, to I would like to say to everybody who might listen to it, to thank you for listening to Indigenous people from Louisiana, because um, I feel like our stories are not heard. And I would say that probably the answer that I was supposed to say for all of this stuff is that the reason I did all of this work was when I realized how often, how much of our culture has been erased, and how present Indigenous people's work is in Louisiana. And it's often attributed to somebody else, usually Cajuns.
You mean like food and things, or?
They take credit for everything. But jazz, like I think that jazz is an incredibly Indigenous thing. I think that the blues, like I feel like, of course, African people contributed amazing amounts to the blues, but I think that as much of the blues came from Indigenous music as African music. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about the Mardi Gras Indians. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about Afro-Indigeneity in general. I think we didn't really get to talk about Afro-Indigeneity in this conversation. So maybe I'll say something about that. I mean, I am definitely French, Native, and Black. I don't necessarily, I mean, I grew up with more shame in my family about being a mixed Black person than being a mixed Native person. And I think that that just speaks to the way Afro-Indigeneity and African people in general are, historically hated in our country. And I think that we need to have more conversations about Afro-Indigeneity in the United States, because even in Louisiana, the Takwa tribe is an Afro-Indigenous tribe. Um, the way that we determine our enrollment is through where people were baptized in mission churches, where the Takwa people were enslaved with African people. Um, and I think that a lot of the conflicts that are taking place in the United States right now are relics of hatred of Afro-Indigenous people. And so I think that that is a conversation, especially in Louisiana Indigenous communities. It really needs to be had, because a lot of the people who have the right to claim indigeneity in Louisiana are people who have disavowed their Afro-Indigenous cousins. And so I think that the basis of my work around all these subjects was originated out of wanting to unerase indigenous people from our histories. And I think that now it's, you know, it's about finding the harmony between all of the parts of who I am and who we are as people in Louisiana. And I think that it's important to remember our indigenous histories, but it's equally as important to acknowledge Afro-indigeneity. And I will say to all people who may, we have this book about Creole Afro-indigeneity coming out on the University of Washington Press. It's going to be a controversial book. We're going to all take a lot of heat for contributing to that book. It's going to cause a lot of uncomfortable conversations that I'm looking forward to engaging in.
Yeah, I also contributed to that book.
Yeah, so, I know. And so I'm looking forward to the conversations that I'm going to have with other indigenous people about that book. And I think that, if we all remember that we're spirits having a human experience, these conversations are going to be a lot easier to have.
Thanks. Yes. Thanks for adding that. I've enjoyed getting to know you, Tanner. It's been a good evening.
Likewise.